Today is July 27th, 2026, and I need you to sit with this number before we go any further. More than 1. 3 million acres have burned across Oregon and Washington this year, and Oregon alone has now officially crossed the 1 million acre threshold, according to the Oregon Department of Forestry. Let that sit for a moment. 1 million acres is not a wildfire season anymore. It is a landscape-altering event happening in real time, right now while you are watching this. This is not the kind of weather update where I tell you to check for rain before you leave the house. This is not routine fire season noise. Communities on the Warm Springs Reservation have already evacuated. 34 large fires are actively burning across the state as I record this, and officials say some of them may not get all the resources they need because there simply aren't enough crews to go around. I want you to understand exactly how we got here, what is actually driving this, and why the next several weeks matter more than almost anything that has happened so far this season. If you have ever lived through a fire evacuation, or if you have family in Central or Eastern Oregon right now, drop a comment and tell me what you're seeing on the ground, because the official numbers are moving fast, and I want this thread to stay current. Then, on July 18th, everything changed. A series of dry lightning storms swept across the state, and within a matter of hours, nearly 90 new wildfires ignited simultaneously. Think about what that actually means. 90 separate fire starts, not from one storm cell, but from a lightning system moving across a landscape that was primed to burn. By July 20th, the statewide total had jumped to nearly 415,600 acres. That number held relatively steady for a few days, and then hot, dry conditions moved in over the weekend, and the acreage skyrocketed past the million-acre mark in a matter of days. That kind of acceleration is not normal fire behavior. It is what happens when fuel, heat, and ignition all arrive in the same window at the same time. Here's the part that changes how you should think about this entire season. This wasn't just bad luck with lightning. The vegetation across Oregon was already abnormally dry and flammable heading into summer because of a record snow drought this past winter. When snowpack is low, the soil and vegetation dry out earlier, and more completely than they would in a normal year, which means that by the time lightning arrives in midsummer, the landscape is primed like kindling, instead of holding the moisture that would normally slow a fire's spread. That is the mechanism connecting a dry winter to an explosive summer, and it is exactly the kind of connection that gets lost when people only see the acreage headline without understanding what built the conditions underneath it. Now let's talk about where things actually stand today, using the confirmed numbers, because vague language does nothing for you here. The single highest priority fire right now is the Akawa Butte Fire, located about 13 miles northeast of Sisters, Oregon. It started on Thursday, July 16th from lightning, and it has grown to roughly 27,287 acres with containment sitting at just 5%. There are currently 1,168 personnel assigned to that fire alone, and the estimated containment date is August 6th, which means firefighters are expecting to be actively battling this single fire for close to 3 more weeks. According to Jessica Newyar, a public affairs officer with the Oregon Department of Forestry, the Akawa Butte Fire remains the department's top priority statewide, ahead of the other 33 large fires currently burning. The Akawa Butte Fire is burning near the scar of the Flat Fire, which torched more than 23,000 acres in the same area back in August of 2025, meaning this landscape has now burned twice in less than a year, which tells you something important about how quickly fire-adapted forests in Central Oregon can reload with fuel and burn again. The largest fire currently active in the entire state is the Big Grass Fire, burning southwest of Jordan Valley in far southeastern Oregon, in one of the most remote and rugged parts of the state. Because that region has fewer nearby communities, it draws less media attention than fires closer to population centers. But the acreage it is consuming is a major driver of the statewide total, And it illustrates something people consistently misunderstand about wildfire coverage. The fires that make headlines are usually not the fires burning the most acreage. They are the fires burning closest to people. That distinction matters when you're trying to understand true statewide risk versus what shows up in your newsfeed. Now here's where I want to bring in a comparison, because raw acreage numbers only tell you part of the story. The human cost of a wildfire season is not fixed by the weather and the fuel alone. It is determined by preparation, infrastructure, and the decisions communities make long before smoke is ever visible on the horizon. Look at the difference between how Sisters, Oregon, and the Warm Springs Reservation are experiencing this season. Sisters sits directly in the path of the Akawa Butte Fire, but the community has spent years on defensible space programs, fuel reduction around the wildland-urban interface, and coordinated evacuation planning with Deschutes County Emergency Management. As a result, even with over 1,000 personnel fighting a fire just 13 miles away, Sisters has been able to avoid a full community evacuation so far, relying instead on staged readiness levels that let residents prepare without abandoning their homes prematurely. Compare that to the situation on the Warm Springs Reservation, where residents have already evacuated. Rural tribal lands in central Oregon often have fewer paved evacuation routes, less dense fire suppression infrastructure, and historically underfunded emergency response systems compared to incorporated cities nearby. That is not a criticism of the people living there. It is a direct illustration of the point I want you to walk away with today. Two communities, similar distance from similar fire behavior, and very different outcomes. Not because the fire behaved differently, but because the infrastructure and preparation behind each community was different. That gap in infrastructure is exactly what determines who has to run and who gets to stay and defend. Let's get into the actual mechanism driving this fire behavior, because understanding the physics changes how seriously you take the next few weeks. Wildfire spread is governed by what's called the fire behavior triangle: fuel, weather, and topography. Right now in central and eastern Oregon, all three are working against firefighters simultaneously. The fuel load is elevated because of that dry winter I mentioned earlier, meaning grasses, brush, and downed timber are carrying less internal moisture than they would in an average year, which makes them ignite faster and burn hotter. The weather component includes low relative humidity, elevated temperatures, and wind, all of which accelerate what's called fire spread rate, essentially how fast the flaming front moves across the landscape. And topography in central Oregon, with its canyons, ridgelines, and mixed conifer forest, creates wind channeling effects that can push fire uphill dramatically faster than it moves on flat ground, sometimes doubling or tripling spread rate on steep slopes. When you combine dried out fuel, hot dry wind, and steep terrain, you get what fire behavior analysts call extreme fire behavior, conditions where a fire can generate its own weather system, throwing embers up to a mile ahead of the main fire front in a process called spotting. That is how a fire jumps roads, rivers, and fire breaks that would normally hold it back. It's not always about the fire creeping forward foot by foot. Sometimes it's about a wall of embers landing well ahead of the flame front and starting new ignition points that firefighters didn't even know to defend. Here are the hard numbers as they stand today, and I want you to hold on to these because they anchor everything else in this story. Statewide Oregon acreage: over 1 million acres burned this season as of July 26, 2026. Combined Oregon and Washington acreage: 1,122,187 acres. Active large fires in Oregon: 34. The Akawa Butte Fire: 27,287 acres. 5% contained. 1,168 personnel assigned. Estimated containment date of August 6th. Acreage burned as of July 13th, before the lightning event: approximately 42,000 acres. Acreage as of July the 20th, 1 week after the lightning storms: nearly 415,600 acres. Number of new fire starts from the July 18th lightning event: nearly 90. Last year's full season total for comparison: just over 570,000 acres. And for historical context, the worst fire year on record in Oregon remains 2024, when 93 million acres burned by the end of that season, becoming the most expensive wildfire year in state history at more than $350 million in suppression and recovery costs. So significant that Governor Tina Kotek had to call a special legislative session to approve an additional $218 million just to backfill the state's firefighting agencies. According to the Oregon Department of Forestry's own 30-year data, only a handful of years have ever crossed the 1 million acre mark before this one: 2002, 2012, 2020, 2021, and 2024. We have now joined that list, and we are joining it earlier in the summer than most of those prior years did, which is exactly why officials are watching the next several weeks so closely. I want to address something directly, because this is where a lot of coverage oversimplifies what's actually happening. When people see fires breaking out across multiple regions of the state at once, in central Oregon, in eastern Oregon, near Jordan Valley, and in pockets closer to the Cascades, there's a natural instinct to ask whether it's all connected, as if there's one massive unified fire event sweeping the state. That's not quite accurate, and I think it's worth being precise here instead of feeding a simplified narrative. These are separate ignition events tied together not by a single fire front, but by a shared underlying cause. The same dry lightning system on July 18th sparked ignitions across a wide geographic area simultaneously, and the same regional drought and heat conditions are now allowing each of those separate fires to grow independently under similar conditions. So it's accurate to say they share a common origin and a common set of accelerating conditions. It's not accurate to say they're one connected fire. Understanding that distinction matters because it changes how you interpret containment progress. Containing the Akawa Butte Fire doesn't mean the Big Grass Fire is any closer to being controlled. Each of these 34 large fires is its own operational fight, with its own personnel, its own terrain challenges, and its own containment timeline, even though they're all drawing from the same limited pool of statewide and regional firefighting resources. And that resource strain is a real, specific concern, not just a dramatic talking point. With 34 large fires burning simultaneously across Oregon, and additional fires burning across the state line in Washington, pushing the combined regional total past 3 million acres, fire management teams are having to make prioritization decisions about which fires get the most personnel, the most aircraft, and the most equipment. That's precisely why officials have explicitly said that some fires may receive fewer resources than they would ideally like to provide. This isn't a hypothetical resource crunch. It's happening right now, with agencies triaging a finite number of hand crews, engines, and aircraft across dozens of active incidents spread over hundreds of miles. Let's go inside who is actually managing this response, because behind every acreage number is a coordinated, exhausting operational effort. The Oregon Department of Forestry is the lead state agency tracking and reporting on fire activity, working alongside the Northwest Interagency Coordination Center, which handles regional resource allocation across both Oregon and Washington. On the ground at the Akawa Butte Fire specifically, more than 1,868 personnel are currently assigned, a mix of hand crews cutting containment lines by hand through steep terrain, engine crews protecting structures along the wildland-urban interface near Sisters, and aircraft conducting water and retardant drops to slow the fire's advance in areas too steep or too dangerous for ground crews to access directly. Public Affairs Officer Jessica Newyar has been one of the primary voices communicating updates from ODF on the Akawa Butte Fire's status, confirming its position as the department's top statewide priority. Setting a containment date of August 6th for a fire that's currently only 5% contained tells you something important about how fire managers think. That date isn't a promise. It's an operational estimate based on current fire behavior, expected weather patterns, and the rate at which crews expect to be able to build and hold containment lines. If conditions shift, hotter temperatures, stronger winds, or another lightning event, that date can move, and fire management teams know that better than anyone, which is exactly why they build in the honest caveat that containment estimates are working numbers, not guarantees. I also want to correct something that tends to spread quickly whenever wildfire acreage numbers get this large, because I'd rather give you the accurate picture than let a scarier but less precise version take hold. When people hear that Oregon has crossed 1 million acres, there's sometimes an assumption that this is already the worst fire season in state history unfolding in real time. It is not, at least not yet, and the honest answer is that we don't fully know how this season will ultimately compare. Based on the current trajectory, Oregon's 2026 season is running well ahead of pace compared to recent years, but it is still tracking behind the catastrophic 2024 season, when the state ultimately burned 93 million acres by the time the season ended in late October. We're currently just under halfway to matching that 2024 total, and it's still July. That's actually the part that should concern you more than a simple comparison to the worst year on record. We are seeing million-acre-plus fire activity earlier in the summer than in most of the state's worst fire years, with the traditionally hottest and driest weeks, August and early September, still ahead. Whether 2026 ultimately surpasses 2024 or lands somewhere in the middle of Oregon's worst years on record will depend heavily on what weather patterns move through the state over the next 6 to 8 weeks. What we can say clearly, based on the actual data, is this. Oregon has already burned more acreage in 3 weeks than it burned in all of 2025, and the season is not close to finished. So what's still coming? And why hasn't the danger passed just because the fire has already made headlines? This is the part of the story that gets lost once a fire has been burning for a week or two and public attention starts to drift elsewhere. Right now, fire danger across central and eastern Oregon has actually eased slightly, moving from critical to elevated, and as of today, there are no active red flag warnings in effect statewide. That sounds like good news, and in the short term it is. But elevated fire danger is still fire danger, and forecasters are already flagging that dry vegetation. Breezy afternoon winds and continued hot temperatures will keep making it easy for new fires to ignite and spread rapidly, particularly on the east side of the Cascades, where the terrain and vegetation are most fire-prone. Meanwhile, west of the Cascades, an onshore flow is currently bringing cooler air, morning cloud cover, and even a chance of light coastal rain, which is providing some temporary relief to that side of the state. But the pattern doesn't reach the areas where the largest and most dangerous fires, including Akawa Butte and Big Grass, are currently burning. In other words, the geography of relief and the geography of danger are not the same right now, and that mismatch is exactly why officials continue urging residents statewide, not just in the fire zones, to follow local burn restrictions and avoid any activity that could spark a new ignition, because a single new fire start under these fuel conditions can escalate within days. The same way the Akawa Butte Fire went from a lightning strike on July 16th to a 27,000-acre priority fire in less than 2 weeks. Let me also flag something that's easy to overlook in the day-to-day acreage updates. Wildfire smoke is currently persisting east of the Cascades, and air quality alerts have been issued as a direct result. This is a slower-moving but genuinely serious part of this story because wildfire smoke exposure carries real public health consequences, particularly for children, older adults, pregnant individuals, and anyone with existing respiratory or cardiovascular conditions. Unlike the flames themselves, which are a localized and visible threat, smoke can travel hundreds of miles beyond the fire perimeter, meaning communities that are in no danger of evacuation can still be breathing genuinely hazardous air for days or weeks at a time. If you are in a region currently under an air quality alert, that risk doesn't require you to see flames to take seriously. Now let's talk about what you should actually do with this information, because I don't want to leave you with just numbers and no direction. If you live anywhere in central or eastern Oregon, especially near Sisters, Jordan Valley, or any community close to an active large fire, know your evacuation zone level before you need it. Oregon uses a 3-level system. Level 1 means be ready, Level 2 means be set to leave at a moment's notice, and Level 3 means go now. Don't wait for a Level 3 notice to figure out your evacuation route for the first time. Have a go bag prepared with essential medications, copies of important documents, a change of clothes, water, and any items you can't quickly replace, and keep it somewhere accessible, not buried in a closet. If you have livestock or large animals, plan your transportation and destination now, because evacuating animals under Level 3 conditions with no plan already in place is one of the most dangerous and time-consuming situations emergency responders repeatedly encounter. Sign up for your county's emergency alert system directly. Don't rely solely on social media or word of mouth to know when conditions change, because those official systems are built specifically to reach you the moment your zone status shifts. If you're outside the immediate fire zones but inside an air quality alert area, limit prolonged outdoor exertion, keep windows closed when smoke is heavy, and if you have access to an air purifier or a high-efficiency filter for your HVAC system, this is exactly the kind of stretch where using it consistently actually matters. And if you have friends, family, or coworkers in the affected regions of Central or Eastern Oregon, share this with them directly. A single share to someone who hasn't been tracking this as closely as you have could be the difference between them finding out their zone changed status from a neighbor 2 hours late or from an alert they already had set up in advance. Let's go a little deeper on the historical pattern here, because it puts this season in a context that raw acreage numbers alone can't give you. Oregon's fire history over the past 3 decades shows something important. Extreme fire years don't happen randomly. They cluster around specific conditions, and those conditions are the same ones lining up right now. 2002, 2012, 2020, 2021, and 2024 all crossed the million-acre threshold. And each of those years shared a common ingredient, a dry winter feeding into a hot, lightning-active summer. 2020 in particular is worth remembering, not just for its acreage total, but for how quickly conditions turned. That year, a wind event in early September pushed already burning fires into an explosive multi-day run that destroyed thousands of structures and displaced tens of thousands of people across the state in a matter of days. I'm not telling you that to suggest 2026 will follow the exact same path, because every fire season is shaped by its own specific weather pattern, and right now we don't have a comparable wind event on the immediate horizon. But I'm telling you that the lesson from 2020 is a real one. Acreage totals can look one way for weeks, and then a single weather shift can compress an entire season's worth of additional damage into 48 or 72 hours. That's precisely why fire managers don't relax just because containment lines are holding today. They're watching the weather models for the next event, not just managing the fire in front of them. It's also worth understanding why this particular stretch of Oregon, Central and Eastern Oregon specifically, tends to be where these explosive fire seasons take hold. The Cascade Range creates what's called a rain shadow effect. Moist air coming off the Pacific Ocean rises over the western slopes of the Cascades, cools, and drops most of its precipitation on the west side of the mountains, which is why places like Portland and the Willamette Valley stay green through summer. By the time that air crosses over to the east side, where Sisters, Jordan Valley, and most of the season's largest fires are burning, it has lost the bulk of its moisture. That leaves central and eastern Oregon naturally drier, dominated by ponderosa, pine, juniper, and sagebrush ecosystems that are already adapted to periodic fire, but also primed to burn explosively when an unusually dry winter compounds that natural aridity. This is also exactly the region where dry lightning is most common in mid to late summer, because thunderstorms that form over the Cascades and push east often produce more lightning than rainfall by the time they reach the drier terrain beyond the mountains. That combination, naturally dry vegetation plus a lightning-prone climate pattern, is not a coincidence. It's the same structural reason this region has produced most of Oregon's largest fires over the past 30 years, and it's the same reason it's producing them again right now. I want to spend a moment on who is most vulnerable in a season like this, because it's not just the people closest to the flames. Older adults and anyone with pre-existing heart or lung conditions face elevated risk from wildfire smoke, even hundreds of miles from the nearest fire perimeter, because fine particulate matter in smoke, the kind small enough to lodge deep in lung tissue, doesn't require proximity to the fire to cause harm. Outdoor workers, agricultural laborers, and anyone whose job keeps them outside for extended hours during an air quality alert face a different kind of cumulative exposure that indoor workers largely avoid. Rural and tribal communities, like Warm Springs, often face a compounding disadvantage, not because the fire itself treats them differently, but because evacuation infrastructure, road access, and emergency communication systems in more remote areas have historically received less sustained investment than infrastructure in larger incorporated cities. And people who are new to a region, seasonal residents, recent transplants, or tourists visiting Central Oregon during peak summer season, are often the least likely to know their evacuation zone level or have a plan in place at all, simply because they haven't lived through a fire season in that specific area before. If you fall into any of those categories, or if someone in your life does, that's exactly the group this next section is for. Let's talk about what people commonly get wrong about how these fires actually spread, because misunderstanding fire behavior leads directly to poor evacuation decisions. A lot of people picture wildfire as a wall of flame creeping steadily across the ground, which gives the impression that you'd have plenty of warning before it reached you. Under the extreme fire behavior conditions I described earlier, that picture is often wrong. Spotting, where wind-driven embers launch up to a mile ahead of the main fire front, means new ignition points can appear well beyond where anyone was watching the fire's edge. That's how homes have historically burned in Oregon and across the West without the main fire front ever technically reaching that property line. It's also why waiting to see visible flames before deciding to evacuate is one of the most dangerous decisions a resident can make in extreme fire conditions. By the time flames are visible from your window, embers may have already been landing on your roof or in your gutters for several minutes. This is precisely why fire officials structure evacuation levels the way they do, with level 2 specifically designed to get people packed and ready before flames are anywhere near visible, not after. I want to bring this back to where we started, because I think it's worth sitting with one more time. 1 million acres. That was the number that opened this. And I told you at the start that this wasn't routine fire season coverage, and I want you to understand why I meant that literally, not just as a hook to get you to keep watching. We are 3 weeks removed from a season that had only burned 42,000 acres statewide. 3 weeks. That is the pace at which conditions can shift from manageable to historic, and it's exactly the kind of shift that catches communities off guard when they assume a slow start means a slow season. The Akawa Butte Fire alone still has close to 3 weeks of active firefighting ahead of it before its current estimated containment date, and that's just one of 34 large fires currently burning across the state, all competing for the same limited pool of personnel and equipment during a stretch of summer that historically gets hotter and drier before it gets better. I'm not telling you this to manufacture fear. I'm telling you this because the actual data supports taking the next 6 to 8 weeks seriously, whether or not you personally live inside an active fire perimeter right now. Because smoke, resource strain, and shifting evacuation zones don't respect county lines, the way headlines sometimes suggest they do. If this is the kind of tracking you want to keep up with as conditions change, subscribe and turn your notifications on. Because a season moving this fast can shift meaningfully within days, not weeks, and I'd rather you hear it from a source walking you through the actual data than from a fragment of a headline with no context behind it. Drop a comment if you're in Oregon or Washington right now and tell me what conditions look like where you are, whether that's smoke, evacuation orders, or just watching the containment percentages the way I am. And if you know anyone in Central or Eastern Oregon, your sisters, near Jordan Valley, or anywhere close to these active fire lines, send this to them directly. Not because I need the view, because the difference between someone who has their go bag ready before a level 3 notice and someone who's scrambling to find it after the notice arrives is sometimes measured in minutes, and this season has already shown us exactly how quickly those minutes can start to matter. I'll be tracking the containment numbers, the resource allocation, and the weather pattern shift heading into August, and I'll bring you the next update the moment the picture changes. One more thing before I let you go, because I think it matters more than a lot of the individual numbers we've covered today. Preparedness is not a single action you take once and forget about. It's a standing state you maintain through the length of an entire fire season, and that's a hard thing to sustain when the news cycle moves on after the first big headline. The communities that come through seasons like this one with the least damage are rarely the ones with the most dramatic story to tell. They're the ones where defensible space around homes was cleared months before lightning ever struck, where evacuation routes were mapped and discussed as a household well before level 2 notice arrived, and where neighbors checked in on each other, especially older residents or anyone without reliable transportation, the moment conditions started to shift. None of that requires a background in meteorology or fire science. It requires treating the early warning signs, a dry winter, an unusually fast jump in statewide acreage, a lightning forecast, as a prompt to act, rather than a piece of background information to scroll past. That's the real through line connecting everything I've walked you through today, from the 42,000 acres in mid-July to the 3 million acres we're standing at right now. The fire doesn't decide who loses a home and who doesn't. The decisions made in the weeks and months before it arrives do that. Keep that in mind as this season continues to unfold, because based on everything the data is showing us right now, it is far from finished.